There's going to be anxiety regardless of how much you prepared, just by the nature of the environment that you're in. I put a lot of that, Frank, back on the field training officer. But one of the biggest fears, and especially for me in any field training program, is fear of the unknown.
Hey there, my name is Frank. I am one of the hosts of Reid On the Record podcast. I am really excited today to introduce Wayne South. Wayne South is going to be a guest on Reid On the Record podcast. A little bit about Mr. South. He is a law enforcement professional with over 28 years of experience in the field of training, mentorship, proven leadership proficiency. From the early stages of Wayne's career, he has felt a calling to training new officers, recruits, refining his agency's current standards, and presenting new and fresh ideas. Wayne found actualization of his talents and abilities by excelling in the role of Field Training Officer, that is FTO, and eventually as the Commander of Training and Education Division at a police department in the state of Florida. So go Florida law enforcement. Wayne has a proven track record of success in the roles of polygraph examiner, patrol commander, a deputy district commander, a commander, and adjunct instructor. I'm really liking the instructor part of that. A highly sought after public speaker, Wayne leads workshops nationwide where his vast law enforcement experience in leadership, mentorship, and training make a positive impact on everybody present. A proud veteran, Wayne was inducted into the National Society for Leadership and Success. He holds an MBA degree and an MA degree in criminal justice. Now, I had the privilege of first meeting Wayne back in the fall of 2024 in Bristol, Virginia. I was a brand new instructor back then with John E. Reid and Associates, and I felt nothing but a warm welcome and helpful hand by Wayne during my time there presenting the Reid technique. The second time around would be in 2025, and as a matter of fact, you can sign up for our seminar. I am scheduled to be in Bristol, Virginia this year again in 2026. Back in 2025, I was made aware that Wayne had authored a book, Training to Lead, Mastering the Art of Training and Inspiring the Next Generation. Wayne South has been not only a lifelong passionate trainer and instructor, but also a huge supporter of the Reid technique of interviewing and interrogation. John E. Reid and Associates, we are all of us lucky to enjoy the support of not only Wayne, but of all the students who attend our seminars in Virginia. So, without further ado, I would like for you to welcome Wayne South to the podcast. Now, me and Dan have a very strict criteria. We don't like to invite authors onto our show unless those authors know what the heck they're talking about. Wayne not only is educated, knows what the heck he's talking about. I am prior law enforcement of 15 years, absolutely dwarfed by Wayne's career in law enforcement. So he has been vetted. Wayne knows what he's talking about. Wayne, welcome to Reid On the Record podcast.
Yes, welcome,
sir.
Wayne.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you want to start, Frank?
Yes, really quick. All of our listeners and viewers, there will be a link to Wayne's book in the show notes, as well as the pinned comment. You can go and pick up a copy of his book at Amazon. I would encourage every single person who purchases a copy off of Amazon to leave Wayne South an honest review. I'm sure as an author, he would really appreciate it, especially those of you in law enforcement. It really means a whole lot when the fellow brotherhood and sisterhood of law enforcement, even people in the private sector out there that gets Wayne's book, having that gritty, realistic review of his book goes a long way to, sensing his street cred on that. And with that being said, we've got a series of questions here for Mr. Wayne South, and I'm going to let Dan step in and take care of it. Dan.
Thank you, Frank. Okay,
yes,
thank
sir.
you again,
Thank
Wayne,
you.
for coming on our show. First of all, Frank, where did the idea of training to lead come from?
Well, Dan, I've been involved in field training programs, and a field training program is a program, if the listeners aren't familiar, that prepares young men and women to enter the profession of law enforcement, corrections, or whatever their chosen profession is. And over the years, I've been involved in FTO programs at all different levels, from being in many FTO programs to being an FTO sergeant, an FTO, and actually an FTO lieutenant. And what I saw over the years were a lot of trainers who didn't put themselves in a position of leadership. And I think that the two most influential people at any department is that of a field training officer and a first line sergeant. So
Now,
that
Frank, I'm sorry, Wayne, what's the purpose of the field training officer?
What's the acronym mean, I guess, of
Yeah.
FTO?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you, Frank.
Well, FTO is Field Training Officer, and the FTO program is designed to build on the foundation that individuals receive at their police academy, and then they come to their respective agency. They go into a field training program, and the FTO takes that knowledge and puts it into a practical, real world application, if you will. In other words, it's one thing to learn theory and policy and stuff like that at an academy. It's an entirely different thing when you're out with the community and you're actually putting that knowledge into action.
Okay, good. All right.
There were, and Wayne, there was a couple of words in there that really caught my attention. You said, the two most important people, at a law enforcement agency is your frontline supervisors and the trainers. And one
Yes,
of the
sir.
takeaways that I immediately walked away from your book is, and I have to confess, this is probably my ignorance, but I had never considered a training officer in a leadership position, but it's really the gateway into an entire agency, isn't it? It's culture,
is.
it's policies, it's procedures, and everything in there.
100%, because the trainee is going to emulate the behaviors they see from the field training officer. And if you think about it, if you break an FTO program down to its lowest common denominator, that FTO is the first link in the chain of command for a trainee. And it is leadership. I do not equate leadership to stars, stripes, and bars. That is legitimate leadership. But leadership at its lowest common denominator to me is one word. It's influence. And if you want to talk about an individual that has a tremendous amount of influence on an individual, it's the field training officer. Because depending on your program, you're going to spend anywhere from 12 to 21 weeks with different field training officers. That's a lot of influence.
Yeah.
It really is, yes. And there's nothing like it's 2 a.m. in the morning. Your FTO officer is going over policy and procedures with you, and then you get a call out there.
Yes.
And I'm probably going off topic just a little bit here, Wayne, but one common denominator in your book is a theme of anxiety and handling a trainee's anxiety. I know when I was going through my law enforcement training, I was probably more afraid of being evaluated than I was of the actual traffic stops, handling the calls for service or anything else. If there's someone who's considering law enforcement, maybe they're in the academy, maybe they're a trainee, what advice would you have for them? Practical advice for handling a lot of that performance anxiety?
Well, there's going to be anxiety regardless of how much you prepared, just by the nature of the environment that you're in. I put a lot of that, Frank, back on the field training officer. One of the tenets of the San Jose model is not only will mistakes be tolerated, but they'll be expected. And I'm paraphrasing that. But one of the biggest fears, and especially for me in any field training program, is fear of the unknown. And part of that fear of the unknown is what's going to happen, or how is the FTO going to react when I make a mistake? Because I'm going to. And if the FTO sets those expectations on day one, I think that will relieve a lot of the anxiety. We know you're going to make mistakes, and a good FTO will turn those mistakes into a training or a learning moment. And that helps create a great learning environment inside the patrol car, or if you're a correctional officer, inside the correctional facility.
I really like that. It's the training officer's persona and presence out there, that calming presence. And this kind of goes back to my training here also at John Reid and Associates. I was really lucky to be mentored by current instructors, as well as some instructors who left us all too soon. But they had a real calming presence, and they said, Frank, you're not going to get the material correct on day 1, day 3. You're going to make mistakes, but it's how you handle those mistakes.
It's very similar to critiquing individuals in interrogations. And with that experienced officer, I can see where they're learning interrogation many times by watching other more senior investigators. And if that senior investigator doesn't get it right or is doing things improper, that's how the new officer is going to be doing their interrogation. So it's important, if you have someone that you're training, in any capacity that you follow the cores and principles that we set up in the Reid technique.
Exactly, yes. And what I like about Wayne's book is he approaches not only training on a tactical level, but on an organizational strategic level as well. Throughout the entire book, there's two other things that will continue to pop up. And that's, hey, if you're under a deposition legally, can you defend and justify what you did in your training program?
Yeah.
Risk liability out there. Risk liability is a huge one for me. So that's really good. Get Wayne's book. I'm telling you, it's good. It's great. Well, Wayne, I have another question for you, sir. Are you ready? Ready for the next one? Okay. So I had a general sense in reading Training to Lead that each of the chapter topics, lessons, and insights came from a place of really deeply personal and professional experience. And in my opinion, no better place illustrates this for the reader than page number 50. And I'm turning to page 50 right now. But on page 50, you outline the acronym, the SMART protocol. And for those of you that are wondering, the SMART protocol is a methodology, I suppose, of evaluating an FTO trainee's, progression through the program. This would be in chapter 4. You said under page number 50, and I'm going to quote, for the S, you have been struggling to proficiently perform a traffic stop from initiation to conclusion. Trainee has struggled to provide the communication center with accurate information. Guilty as charged on me when I was in my FTO training program. My FTO officer said, Frank, everything went great. When were you going to tell dispatch where you were? I was like, oh my God. So this led me to wonder, was there a personal experience where you were a trainee or you were an FTO officer where you struggled with teaching or performing a traffic stop or other police protocol? And if so, what was your takeaway from that moment?
Well, I think, my takeaway, and I read your question and I was trying to think of something specific, and I just have to answer that in a generic or general sense. All trainees, regardless, even if they come from a different agency, and they have experience, when they come to your agency, there's just little nuances that are different. So everyone's going to struggle with something. And when I teach problem solving and critical thinking skills, which is something that I think is desperately needed in this profession, I teach getting to the root cause. And if you want to get to the root cause, you can either use Peter Senge's 5 whys or you can use the SMART model to correct, I hate to use the word simple, but non-complex issues, something like traffic stops. And the SMART model, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, the SMART model is like a GPS for a trainee. In other words, I like the example of a traffic stop because just about everyone struggles on traffic stops, and I probably still did the day I retired, but we get a little bit better at them. If someone's struggling with traffic stops, you can draw a roadmap for improvement using the SMART model. And one of the things that I learned too really quickly as an FTO is that everyone learns differently. And then I went to a class on adult learning, and I was just blown away when the instructor said, always keep in mind that this program, the FTO program, is not yours. It's the trainees, and the trainee drives the training. In other words, adults can only learn at their capacity. So a lot of times FTOs get frustrated when trainees aren't catching on to something quickly. And that's because we're putting our perspective on it. So if you take the SMART model, you can break it down into really simple terms. It's a roadmap that they can follow, and you're there with them working through that. And hopefully by the end, if you set a 2-week time frame for a traffic stop, for example, to show improvement, by the end of that 2 weeks, you should be showing quite a bit of improvement. That's why I like the SMART model.
I really love the SMART model too, because at least in my FTO training program, I can remember on phase 2, and they said, well, Deputy Shumpert, do you have anything that you're, that's giving you anxiety over, or is there anything that you're worried about? And I said, well, yeah, the felony traffic stops, your interdictions, stuff like that. And they were just throwing me against the wall. Nothing against, okay. But, and then there was always this kind of questioning debrief after that. Well, what did you do wrong? What do you think you did wrong? And what I like about the SMART model is it takes that critical evaluation off of the trainee's shoulders, and it puts it into like Yeah, yeah, it puts it onto a program is what it is. So I like that. Identifying
Absolutely.
exactly what you need to do.
And you hit on a key point there. If you ask a trainee to critique their own performance, humans, we're going to critique ourselves probably more stringent or harder than the FTO will. So if you ask a trainee to critique a traffic stop, for an example, as an example, you will hear things in their answer that you didn't see or you didn't hear or you didn't pick up on. And that's very valuable information. One, you have to reassure the trainee that they're on the right track. But secondly, that's great information that you can use to put into this smart bottle. Like I said, because I put my perspective on a traffic stop, you put your perspective on a traffic stop. So hearing it from their perspective might give you insight to how they learn the best and things that they're struggling with that maybe you didn't catch. And it might be something very simple.
I like that. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I have another question for you, Wayne, if
Yes.
you're ready for it. Okay.
Please.
All right. Yes. I'm thinking about chapter number 5, the adult learner. And what a great question to kind of pivot over as we talk about the different ways that the adult learner can learn. What I loved about that chapter is you go into a lot of detail on how to assess someone's level of skill and information retention specifically. And on page number 61, you listed the highest level for demonstrating mastery of a subject or protocol to be training others. And you gave this a 90% retention rate. And as I recall my own my career here at John Reid and Associates, I can only attest to that.
Yes.
Whenever you have to teach a topic, it's entirely different than actually using it. So,
Absolutely.
and I'm just wondering out loud here is what
Yeah.
is it about teaching a topic exactly that compels a human being to become so good at actually doing what you're out there and teaching versus any other method, in your opinion?
Well, the 90% was actually assigned by the learning pyramid that takes it from lecture to teaching others. So we know that lecture, if you have a class that's purely lecture, according to the learning pyramid, they'll retain about 5 to 10% of it. The learning pyramids are different. I don't know why, but some of them are a little bit different. But so you can sit into a class, for example, you could sit into a class for a read interview and just listen and not be involved in it. And you'll take away some of it. But if you know that you have to get up in front of a class and actually teach part of it, do a teach back, you'll pay a little more attention. You'll be a little more involved in the class. And then when you get up and actually teach it, the first thing you'll do is make a connection with the class. The first thing FTO will do is make a connection with the trainee. And it's just the reps because, the first time you teach it anything, we're going to have a little bit of anxiety, just like the trainee does. We're going to struggle just a little bit. You're going to go home. You're going to study. You're going to add your personal touch to it. You're going to put your stories, your examples into it. And just over time, you become a mastery because, to master anything, it takes patience and patience tells us that all good things come with time. So when you actually teach others, you put your perspective on it. You ask the students for their perspective and you take away something from every class that you teach. Now, when you talk about training others, I like material from John Wooden, former UCLA basketball coach.
Yeah, yeah.
And John Wooden says that to truly teach someone, it's 4 steps, and you'll appreciate this. The first thing you do is explain it. That's the lecture part. That's us in the classroom just talking about it. You demonstrate it. You pull up a video and you talk about an interview, or you actually do a traffic stop and show the trainee how to do the traffic stop. And then you let them imitate it. In other words, I did a traffic stop. You did an interview. Now it's time for me to do an interview or you to do a traffic stop. And then you just have to get the reps in. You just have to get the repetitions in to put that into long-term memory where, I hate to use this terminology, but where you can do it without thinking, so to speak. And that's just repetition. And when you teach others, that's what you're doing, is you're taking that material from working memory to long-term memory.
I like that. What a
That's an
succinct way
excellent
of
point. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, it is. Yes. And, not to kind of go off topic here on us, Wayne,
No.
but whenever it comes to learning the basics in law enforcement, and I'm thinking traffic stops, your basic responses to calls for service, and this is a hypothetical, but if you have someone who's brand new into law enforcement, they're looking to go into it, do you think that they should go to an agency where they have a higher level call volume versus a lower level call volume just so they can work on getting those steps in? Or do you think it's better to start with lower call volume at a smaller agency and maybe work your way up to a place that has higher call volume? And it's not either or. This is just a question that
Well,
popped into my mind. I didn't.
no, and there again, you're going to see that I put a lot of weight on the FTO's shoulders. I worked at a very busy agency, very, very little downtime. And part of the FTO's job was to make sure that the trainee didn't get overloaded or inundated with calls. So if you work at an agency with a smaller call load, it's hard to get those reps in. It really is.
Yeah.
And a lot of things, quite frankly, at some smaller agencies, you just don't have some of the crime that you have. And that's a good thing, right? If you live in those communities, you just don't have the crime that you have at some of the larger, busier agencies. For an example, I'm friends with the chief of police up in the northern Illinois area, and he worked at an agency for 25 years. They never had a murder. 2 weeks after he was appointed chief of police, their agency had their first murder. No one had ever worked a murder at that organization. So I like, if you work at an agency that doesn't have the call volume, then the FTO has to do a lot of the what ifs. They have to do a lot of the scenarios. They have to do a lot of the practical applications and explain it and demonstrate it as best they can. So that's a long way to get to. I like an agency that's busier because
I love that answer. Yeah,
because the trainee gets exposed to a lot very quickly.
I'll run into the same. Well. First of all, whenever I was in law enforcement, I'm trying to gather my thoughts here very quickly. But if we had someone that came in from an outside agency, we could instantly tell the ones that were used to humping calls, as we called it, right? Going from call to call to call to call. Right. They could handle a domestic, an assault, a robbery, all various assaults, a homicide calls, partial homicide, a hit and run, versus the ones who couldn't find the code and law track. They couldn't find anything in it. Right. And I am often asked at the Reid seminars, they say, Frank, how do we get as good as those interrogators in the videos that you're showing? And they say, whenever we walk out of here, what do we need? And I give them the normal spiel, look in your workbooks, get in contact with instructors. But I also tell them this. I tell them, Wayne, and I tell them this too, Dan. I said, you need quantity. I said, your progress is going to be this much if you're only doing 2 interviews a month, bro, or sis, whatever. You need 10 interviews a month, structured interviews, to really get good at this. Yes. And then what I love about this book as well, Wayne, is that you're heavy and you're big on documentation.
100%.
I had an FTO officer tell me, says, Frank, I'm not dinking you. He said, but he says, if we're going to figure out who our all-star players are, we have to have a scorecard. And I really like the documentation process of this as well. Do you have any thoughts to add on that as far as documenting a recruit, their progress through it?
Absolutely. And the hard thing for FTOs is learning that they have to document just as much on the successes as the struggles. But I also tell FTOs, there is a good chance in your career that you're going to have to testify about the training that you provided to one of your trainees. And if you have no documentation, what are you going to testify to?
Thank you. Yes.
I'm huge on documentation, and I was a stickler on documentation. I wanted the narratives on the calls. Our agency, just for an example, we did daily observation reports, DORs, and the FTO had to write something after every call. Did a traffic stop, what they were good at, what they struggled with. Did a domestic, what they were good at, what they struggled with. I wanted my trainers to put the policy number in that narrative for the call and tell the reader that they went over the policy with the trainee to improve those areas that they struggled with. State laws, statutes. I wanted them very, very specific. The reason being is twofold. One, you're going to have to testify to that one of these days, or you might, maybe you won't, but you might. And if you put policy numbers in there and you do have to go to court, then the courts go back to the policy that was in place on that day, because agencies archive all their policies. They don't just update them and delete them. So they archive them. So you go back to that day. And 5, 6, 7 years from now, an officer gets into a use of force situation and their training records are subpoenaed, and you get a subpoena to court. Do you want something that looks like this, that's full of words, or do you want to go to court and try to testify to this? And that's why I'm such a stickler on documentation. It is a written history of the training that you provided them.
You are cutting against the grain there, Mr. Wayne South, because
I always have.
Yeah, I can tell. Oh man, that is wonderful too. And I think every single officer out there who's a training officer, think about that. Think about the day that you may have to testify as to how you taught and what you taught a recruit. Because at least in the Southeast, I'm speaking from my law enforcement career, there is a perception that less is best. The less documentation there is, the better. That is an old way of thinking. It's that dog is not going to hunt. The dog ain't going to hunt, as we say in South Carolina. Not anymore, it won't. Absolutely not.
And Frank, I had a short stint in South Carolina in my career as well. And in the correctional program I was in, I worked in a corrections facility for 2 years, and I don't think there was any documentation for the day and a half of training that I received. And
a day and a half?
Wow.
We'll come check on you if you need anything. Call us. and when I went to the city police department in that area, I don't recall any documentation. I really don't.
Yeah, I know.
I don't recall. At most, there might have been a checklist that said meets minimum standards, and minimum standards is another one of those words that I have an issue with a lot of times, because the thing with FTOs is you have to teach them that everybody's 100 is at a different place. Everybody's capable. Everybody's capabilities are different, so everybody's 100 is different. So a generic definition of a minimum standard doesn't apply to everyone. And the hard thing is getting the FTOs to meet the individual where they're at and not where we expect them to be. But now, with that said, the question always comes up, you never negate accountability, but we have to learn what their capabilities are and apply whatever your definition of minimum standard is to that individual, and not to a policy or procedure that says this is what minimum standards look like.
It goes back, Wayne, to training being a shoe-in for leadership, and really good leadership at that level, especially at a front line and you're going out and you're answering calls. Because I have found that in the absence of a rigorous FTO training program, in the absence of leadership at the squad level, what you get is this kind of poisonous culture of, well, let's see if she or he is cut out to be in law enforcement.
Yes.
And then they set up this cube of, okay, they're struggling in this area, they must not be cut out to be a cop. And then I've seen them just turn on really good recruits, and then they end up quitting. And I know that it was BS, because they'll go to another agency where they have a really good training program and they excel. They do really, really well there. Yeah, it does.
Absolutely.
Yes, it is. Well, Dan?
It sounds, Frank, as you were mentioning that, getting off the topic, that sounds like the Chicago Bears. Every player that the Bears release because they're not performing excels at another team. And you wonder then, it's not the player's fault, it's the training that they're receiving that kind of makes that player good or bad. And that. So I just thought I'd throw that in.
And, if I may, I always tell FTOs when they become an FTO, I'm like, it's a lot of work if you do it right, but you owe it to that trainee to show up every day, be consistent, do it right. And, we all have bad days as well. And unfortunately, when we have a bad day, we need to we need to hit the reset button before we interact with the trainee or get in the car with them, because everything that you do is influence. And trainees, I know we're like sponges. We soak up everything that we see and that we hear. And you mentioned culture earlier. And those behaviors that you model as an FTO, they truly are teaching the trainee what the culture of the organization is. And I always say model the behavior that you want to see in your trainees when they're solo.
Exactly. Yes. And what I found out as well is that you can be the best training officer in the world. And this kind of goes back to this is going to kind of flow into my next question here for you, Wayne. But when I reflect on my own real short, narrow law enforcement career, I've often found that the best training programs and protocols are always downstream of outstanding leadership at the agency. And
Yes.
what's the importance of having a police chief, a sheriff, or an agency head fully behind their training division and supporting the efforts of an FTO?
Well, I'll say it again. The FTO and the sergeant are the most influential people in an organization, but your CEO, regardless what their title is, the FTO and the sergeants, they get their support from the CEO. So the chief or the sheriff or the administrator. And I think that the FTOs, that's psychological support. They have to know that they have the support of the agency head and that they believe in the program. And if you have that, you're going to have FTOs that are field training officers that are more comfortable doing their job because they know, and you're only going to document the facts, not opinion. You're going to document the facts. But when you document the facts and you're challenged on those, you know that you have the support of the agency head, the chief or the sheriff. And I've got a saying that if the Sarge doesn't like it, no one does. And for the FTO programs, if the chief, the sheriff, or the administrator doesn't support the program, then you will have a training program that only goes through the motions.
Exactly. Yes, that's right. Yes. The sheriff, chief, the agency head, the CEO,
Yes.
they are the energy that charges the battery.
They are. They have to trust their trainers and their training coordinators when they bring up issues or they say we need to change this to make it better because I went to a school or in practical purpose this doesn't work and all we're doing is trying to make our programs better and the person that signs off on that's the chief or the sheriff, so you have to have their support to make your program better as well, and they have to allocate the resources to it. In other words, I think every FTO should have the basic field training course, they should have a first line leadership course, and they should have to go to an instructor development course. Now, that's not always practical at organizations, but ideally, that's what I would like a new FTO to attend before they get their first trainee. A lot of training, yes. However, you are grooming the next generation at your organization, and what do you want it to look like?
Exactly. To ask you a question, Wayne, and I promise I'm not going to be taking up too much more of your time, but my brain is starting to get fired up now.
It's okay.
So you were in charge of a training division. You've been a supervisor. Whenever an agency needed, an FTO trainer, what did you look for? Who was the perfect candidate for a position like that?
Well, I'm going to give you an answer that's probably a little different than you'll hear from most people. I didn't always look for the person that went out and did 1,000 traffic stops a month. I didn't always look for the person that went out and made all these narcotics arrests. And yes, before I get blown out of the water for that, they are important. I liked that steady individual that answered a lot of different calls they were good at traffic stops. They could make the drug arrest when necessary. They were good with domestics. They were good with victims. They were good with suspects, but they were also good with the community. I'm a huge believer in Robert Peel and Robert Peel's principles, the Peelian principles, and I liked to select people who believed in the community and would introduce their trainee to the community, but they were also excellent at their job. Now, I couldn't do this when I was at work for a lot of different reasons, but I'm an advocate of a selection process that involves the FTO picking 5 of their best investigative reports, and the date has to be 6 months prior to the date that they apply. So
I like that. Yeah.
because you can learn a lot about an officer through their investigative reports.
Yes.
How thorough are they? Do they rush calls? Do they give complainants the time that they're asking for? Do they do follow-up? So the way they write reports is the way they're going to train. And I love the idea of incorporating the incident reports into a selection process.
Nothing reveals future behavior like past behavior. Wayne, that is so good.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen. Oh man, we had a major domestic call one time. I mean, this thing was awful. Well, my shift didn't, but I was receiving a briefing from, the relieving shift, right? And
Right.
I pulled up the report at the end of the night just to read it, and it was 4 sentences long. I'm like, dude, you made 3 arrests, 2 people went to the hospital. It's
Wow.
4 sentences long.
Right. Oh my gosh.
But hey,
Yeah.
that officer made, 50 arrests a month, on simple
Right.
PO cases. So, it's that's pretty good. Wayne, that is wisdom from the trenches, friends. Wisdom from the trenches right here. You know that Wayne
Excellent.
is the real deal. He's the real freaking deal. I love that. Dan, I think you've got some questions for him.
I do, Wayne. In
Yeah.
chapter 11 of your book, which is common learning disorders, you mentioned the learning disabilities and challenges that certain recruits may face in their duty. Is that, can you share any personal stories or from your career where you helped a recruit overcome some of their challenges and excel in their job?
Well, Dan, this chapter came along much later in my life, actually after I had retired. And I was at a conference and we invited a friend of mine, and I didn't ask him, so I won't say his name. He's still working. We invited him to speak at this conference, and he spoke about learning disorders and that he had went through a training program with a learning disorder. And a light bulb went off, and I started going back into my trainee Rolodex and thinking of the issues that a lot of my trainees struggled with, and some of them unfortunately didn't make it through the training program. And when I started looking at dyslexia, ADHD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, I saw all of that in some of the trainees that I had, but we never talked about those things in any training program. So I wasn't familiar with them when I was training. And so this chapter came about in that just for an introductory informational type chapter, you can't ask a trainee because you can't violate their privacy. But if you see some of these things I talk about in chapter 11, you can change the way that you trained. And that was the biggest thing that I really wanted to get the message across with this chapter. Have I helped people overcome obstacles? Absolutely. Did I know at the time if they had a learning disorder? No, I didn't, unfortunately, which is why I think it's so important that we talk about it now. Report writing and geography. Now, I have to admit, and my wife will agree, I was never good at geography. I struggled from the day I started to the day I retired. I made it there, but I wasn't always the fastest one. Report writing, I saw so many people struggle with report writing, and I would spend a lot of time with trainees on report writing. Social awkwardness is what I hear now in the classes that a lot of trainers are dealing with. And fortunately, I didn't deal with a lot of that. Most of the trainees that I had, they were fairly good with the community and fairly good talking to people. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
It does.
But this chapter, like I said, the inspiration for this was based on an individual, a friend of mine, and it came along much later in life. I would have loved to have had this information, just this introductory information. I hate to say it, 30 some odd years ago when I first became an FTO.
I love that. I love that. Yes.
I have another question for you, Wayne, here is that what advice do you have for law enforcement officers who, let's say, in mid-career, they feel burned out, stuck in a rut? What advice do you have to break out of these things and take care of themselves and finding real meaning in their job? I mean, we see it at our course where you just get some people that will sit there at this training that they've been sent to and never take a note, just sit there and you're wondering, are you getting through to this person? Then you see other people that fill up a book. They got to change their pens every day because they're writing so much. Yeah.
Well, Dan, I had an individual in one of my classes, and I provide workbooks and never even opened the cover.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found out in talking to him later, I was talking to him because he noticed every now and then that I would glance down at his notebook. And on one of the breaks, he told me that he is a true auditory learner, and that he's like, I'm hearing your message. I just don't have to write things down, which is not me. I'm the one that wears out the ink pen every day.
Yeah. I think nothing's worse for the instructor when you see something like that, and your first thought is that, why is the department wasting their money sending this person to this type of training?
Yeah.
And it's always more from the instructor standpoint, might include it, it's a waste of time. But when you sit back and you talk to the individual, even if you don't find out about how you mentioned about an auditory learner, you find out, hey, my impression was really wrong with this person. They are absorbing a lot of what I say. They don't. Everybody doesn't have to write everything down.
Right. But now, on that same note, one of the first questions I ask, and I ask it kind of in a humorous kind of way, I'm like, who are my hostages? Right. And my hostages are the people that got the email the day before the class and said, hey, you have to go to the class.
Yeah.
They're not real happy about being there. Some of them, but I'm like, regardless, you're going to have fun in this class. We do get a lot of people in the class though that maybe they're trying to find their purpose again. Maybe they're a little bit burnt out. They're a little bit stressed out with their organization. And sometimes, I hate to call it a mini vacation, but being able to come to a class for 2, 3, 4 days just gets them away from that routine for a couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps it'll help, them focus on themselves. A lot of frustration from officers comes from they get hyper focused on the organization and they don't focus on themselves. And one of the biggest things I tell people is you have to take care of yourself first, and the organization will take care of itself. So if you take care of yourself, maybe you can find that purpose again. Now, when you talk about burnout and stress and things like that in FTO programs, I also think, to go off topic just for a second, I also think that any good FTO program needs to have a mechanism for their field trainers so that when they start becoming burned out, because it happens when you get trainee after trainee after trainee, that they have a mechanism in place to give them a break.
Yeah.
And this goes back to leadership, Wayne.
It does.
Having a really good CEO. And because what I have seen is a lot of the FTOs will get burned out, especially in agencies that are unfortunately experiencing high turnover rates.
Yes.
You get someone through, all 4 or 5 phases of it, and then they quit, they go somewhere else, and then you have to start back over. So having really effective leadership, a strong culture of self-identity really helps to relieve a lot that stuff there. So
absolutely. And Dan,
but one other thing too, Frank, Wayne, is that I just thought of this question is that you're talking about the new recruit training them, is that a lot of times in our programs, our seminars, you find more experienced investigators coming to the course, but the comment that Frank and I and a lot of our instructors constantly hear from them is not a question, but gosh, I wish I had this when I first started, and that what, from your experience, is the rationale of departments waiting, not getting people involved in interview and interrogation till they have a lot more experience on the street rather than, let's say, when they're just coming out of the academy?
Well, Dan, I use this saying for a lot of different things, and I'll say that it's not important until it is. And when you have a new police officer, and I say under 3 years as a new police officer, if you have a new police officer that does an interview on a domestic or a robbery and they really botch the interview, then all of a sudden interview classes become important. I'm an advocate of interview classes. I'm an advocate of getting new officers to leadership classes just to change their perspective a little bit. I tell people the good thing about going to a class such as an interview class is that it causes you to think differently. And if you take those tools and you take them back to your workplace, you're going to apply them right away. And when you do that, you find your interviews getting better and you get interested in it. And when you get interested in something, it's almost like a hobby. Then you start watching interviews online. You start getting you start going to your website and reading the materials again and listening to the podcasts and you just find yourself completely immersed in it. And I think that's a win-win for any organization. But Dan, I will
Train
say,
them early. Yeah.
Yes, I will say, a lot of agencies that I have been to, their training budget is just not where it needs to be. And I know that CEOs struggle with that constantly, but I will say that your training budget, I think that should be very high on the list when you're doing your annual budgets and trying to get officers as much of this training as possible. And one of the ways to get even more return on your investment is start sending officers to train the trainers. And I'm a big believer in micro training, and especially if you do shift briefings, 10 minutes a day is all it takes. Just pick a topic and talk about it for 10 minutes, or send somebody to the Reid interview class and then have them stand up and teach for 10 or 15 minutes at shift briefing, just giving the highlights of the class.
I just wanted to kind of close out. My advice to everyone out there is buy a copy of Wayne's book. You need to go out there immediately and get a copy of it. There will be a link in the show notes, and you can watch this podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to it. We are on video now, gentlemen, as well, on Apple and Spotify. How about that? We're on video. Link in the show notes, as well as the first pinned comment. It goes directly to the Amazon where you can purchase a copy. And be sure to leave Wayne a review. Leave him a review. Yes, leave him a review. It helps. It helps Amazon know where to find the book. So,
and it makes us
Wayne, again, we appreciate you taking the time to come on, and it's all good advice you had. I hope people
very good. Yes,
adhere to it.
Well, thank you again for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Wayne.
Great.